Metroid 2: Return of Samus was kind of a surprise follow-up back in the day. Not because the first game didn't deserve a sequel, it was a huge success, but because it bypassed the usual console follow-up formula set by series like Mario and Mega Man, and instead set up the next main entry on the beefy grey brick known as the Game Boy. With that change in hardware came some gameplay changes too. Some were good and established mechanics still present in the series today, such as save and recharge stations, as well as visually distinct suit upgrades due to the lack of color on the original Game Boy. Some concessions had to be made too, though, for the smaller monochrome screen, and those left Metroid 2 feeling a little less Metroid-y than the first game. It wasn't as much of a drastic departure as other second games, such as Mario or Zelda, but the Metroid series also wasn't really as well positioned to take risks, especially after a 5-year gap between games. See, this new entry still lacked a key feature: a map. But unlike the first game, that was able to use differently colored environments and ample screen space to designate location differences, Metroid 2 was much more zoomed in for the small screen real estate available, and despite best efforts to mix up the visual environments, it still wasn't terribly conducive to large, open areas you need to backtrack through. This left Metroid 2 a bit at odds with its own structure, where you still move forward, finding power-ups that give you access to other areas, but it was noticeably more linear than the game that came before it. You had fairly free access to your immediate area, but deadly acid or lava or something blocked your progress forward until you found all the necessary upgrades to search and destroy each Metroid threat in that area. Then you move on to the next area. Repeat. This went a long way to help people that were easily lost in the first game, myself included, but it also kind of got old pretty quickly when you know that you never have to go back to an area after you've cleared out all the Metroids there. Combine that with a lack of really any other bosses aside from just stronger Metroid forms and the final fight against their queen, and you're left with a game that doesn't quite stand the test of time as well as its NES predecessor, even if it did still evolve the series and its universe in many important ways. In case you couldn't tell by that intro, I'm not the biggest fan of Metroid 2, so this has been a hard one for me to analyze. But welcome back anyway. Unless you didn't watch my video on the first game in the series, then do that, come back here to the timecode just before I said welcome back, and you too can feel just as welcome as the rest of the viewers. But yeah, like I said last time, I want to try to go into these critiques as unbiased as possible, but considering there's also technically 3 versions of this game out there, all fairly different from each other, it's just a game that's naturally tough to do a critique on. Especially since the most recent canonical version of the game retcons some lore stuff to help lead directly into Metroid Dread, so I'm not sure I want to touch on those aspects right now before we've even covered story or anything from Super or Fusion. So I've decided to do it my way. I'm going to compare the differences between the original Metroid 2 and the popular fan game Another Metroid 2 Remake, though the comparison will mostly just be in visual adaptation and structure, because I've never really made it that far in Metroid 2 to do a real deep dive on that version of the game. I will still pepper in some details from the 3DS remake, mostly how it handles the story since that game is actually canon, unlike AM2R, but I want to save the game mechanics and overall gameplay changes for its own video at the end of this series, after I've had some time to really sit with Metroid Dread and compare it since in some ways Samus Returns is also the closest we have to that new Switch game, despite the story taking place before Super and Fusion. You can definitely see where they kind of trickled in some of those elements to expand the lore in preparation for the game that they probably already knew they were going to make, or at least hoped to make. It honestly just felt weird to me, analyzing the newest Metroid game release between these other games that are so much more mechanically dated in comparison. Plus, Samus Returns is a great Metroid game, and the quality of life improvements feel very modern and polished, but it's also not as faithful of a Metroid 2 adaptation as AM2R is. So, in lieu of actually playing through the dated Game Boy original for this video, I want to put a title in the spotlight that not only issues much closer to the original it's based on, but also much closer mechanically to the other three mainline games. The Super will still feel like a bit of a step back in time as the oldest game on the list with no remake to speak of yet, fan or official.
Metroids. Numerous incidents in the past have brought to light the highly destructive power of these life forms, spreading fear across all known planetary systems. Hoping to secure peace in the galaxy, the Galactic Federation orders the extermination of the Metroid species. I was the best candidate for the job. Once again, I find myself standing alone against the Metroid menace. What horrors await me within the depths of their homeworld?
I want to start by detailing the lore of this game and why I don't really care for how it's paced, though I do think AM2R is the best paced version of this game's structure. Metroid 2 is a direct follow-up to the NES original, though again most story is reserved for the manual. Samus has destroyed Mother Brain and the space pirate threat on Zebes and is sent to the Metroid homeworld of SR-388 to basically clean up shop so that the space pirates can never take and breed the Metroids again. Full Metroid genocide, in other words. It's honestly a pretty dark premise, but as far as Samus knows, Metroids are a galactic nuisance that are being weaponized by the space pirates, so what other option is there? Probably a lot of things, honestly. This is like a kid that won't stop touching the hot stove, so you just burn the whole house down so the kid can't touch anything. You don't burn the kid, though. This isn't Star Wars. But yeah, this is what the Federation decided, and Samus follows her orders, so you land on SR-388 and begin the trek down to its depths, killing every indigenous life form along the way. Along with the HUD displaying Samus's health and missile count, there is also a count of how many Metroids are in the immediate vicinity. So each progression area is basically gated off by acid, or lava, or whatever that purple stuff is in the 3DS version, and Samus is given free reign in a fairly closed-off area to track down any collectibles, power suit upgrades, and Metroids that exist in that region. Like I mentioned up top, it's a smart structure for a Game Boy game that still doesn't include a map, as it remedies some of the aimlessness of the NES original, and facilitates the more generic environments that the Game Boy is capable of by keeping you from exploring too far away from your current objective. But it also eliminates some of the appeal of Metroid by having much more linear progression. It tends to just go as follows. Enter a new area, check all branching paths for items or Metroid nets at dead ends, and then when the Metroid count hits 0 and the screen shakes, go back to the previously lava-filled crossroads and explore deeper down that now open path to the next area. Repeat. The original Game Boy game, at least, had almost no backtracking, and item locations weren't terribly well hidden since you could basically guarantee you'd have the power-up to reach said collectible before leaving the area. AM2R is structured a little closer to more modern Metroid games, but it's still hindered just by being a fairly faithful remake of that original game. There are a few added progression items, such as the speed booster, and they do a very good job at providing clever environmental puzzles in each area to mix up the gameplay and make each area feel distinct to relieve some of the repetitive Metroid killing elements. In fact, this version of the game drastically downplays the importance of the Metroid fights in general, especially compared to how long they take in Samus Returns. And it's a big part of why this is my favorite version. You spend way more time exploring and tracking down hidden items than you do fighting the same Metroids over and over. It also uses some tricky battlefield layouts to mix up the fights, rather than Samus Returns' over-reliance on just prolonging the fights across multiple samey rooms as the Metroids run away with their tails tucked between their legs. AM2R also has some pretty good sub-bosses aside from just the repetitive Metroid fights. And while I didn't find any of them as clever or memorable as Diggernaut, for example, they do feel challenging and distinct from the rest of the samey fights. One, in particular, after you get the space jump boots, is a pretty cool showcase of a space jump focused boss fight, and that's not generally a power-up that gets the spotlight in combat. The fight can sometimes be annoying because of the narrow vertical shaft you're fighting in and the way projectiles can come at you from off-screen, but it still gets points for originality. Where the overall Metroid 2 elements of this game still falter, however, the creativity applied to the visual adaptation of Metroid 2's map is sometimes mind-blowing. The map itself is nearly identical. There are obviously new and expanded areas thanks to an expanded power set, but the actual shape and layout of each room is pretty spot on, unlike Samus Returns, which more so adapted the idea of each area without really staying true to the overall layout. It's interesting though, because you can play these two remakes back to back and have a pretty drastically different experience with them. And I do like how two different teams can adapt the same game in such different ways. But anyway, because AM2R sticks much closer to the overall level design, it takes its liberties with how it interprets the visual design of each area, mostly just based on the type of native enemies in that area and the vague look of the blocks on the Game Boy. Most areas are still introduced with a large, open cavern and some central structure with various hallways branching off. I guess due to the spider ball being the main method of tracking the map layout early on, but each area is still surprisingly visually distinct. One key example is the Hydro Station. It features a central structure with various morph ball-sized pipes running through it, and you have to enter the structure from multiple sides to find your way through the complex pipe system, including utilizing the hydro-powered bomb slots to blast through to other parts of the structure. Many enemies in this area appear to be security drones and defense turrets, which fits the more industrial nature of the area as well. Contrast this with the industrial complex, which feels more like a weapons testing facility. Despite still being full of robots and industrial machinery, this area is much more electronic and aged, with various machinery in disrepair or malfunctioning, and it features a unique little puzzle where Samus controls an enemy drone through a maze to open a super missile barrier before she actually has super missiles herself. Honestly, my main problem with the Metroid 2 stuff is that it's just weird that all of this stuff exists and functions so deep in the planet as the lava or whatever is slowly drained. That kind of kills any appreciation for creativity because I keep coming back to that linear progression gimmick of gating you off one area at a time. Clearly, the whole planet thrives, but the barrier prevents Samus from traversing. Wouldn't that also, corrode the machinery and kill the things living down there? I mean, there's an area further down that's essentially a Chozo mining facility. You know, the people who made Samus's power suit. You'd think they could survive the lava flows. I know it's just a game, and none of this really matters, but the Metroid series does such a good job at using the environmental storytelling to gate off progress. This artificial barrier system just doesn't work for me. Especially since there's multiple times when you can't get any further down anyway without some item from the area you just completed. So why even have the lava gimmick? Just block off the path with an item. Scatter the Metroids in a more organic way where the final Metroid you can access leads to an item you need to go deeper, and gate progress through Samus's own abilities instead. The gates worked for the Game Boy when there was no map or easy way to keep the player on track, but in both of these remakes it just feels weird. Especially in Samus Returns, we have to basically activate a Chozo lock using the Metroid DNA to unflood the next area. Is unflood a word? I can't think of another one. It's fine. Wait. Drain. Drain is the word I was looking for. There's just a few more areas of this game I want to cover before we wrap up, because I frankly just don't have as much to critique, but this remake does have some really clever ideas I want to discuss that try and make the game more memorable. The first area I want to touch on is the greatly expanded tower section. Again, large open area with a central structure, but while the tower itself isn't majorly changed from the Game Boy, it has an added sub-area that basically powers the whole area underneath it. And it was a really cool, tense section. At first I thought I was headed to the end of the game here. It had that kind of Torian feel, and I was confused because I knew I didn't have everything yet, but it turns out the ominous nature of this area is by design, as you reach the bottom and find the main power station malfunctioning. The water power from the hydro station ends here, and is temperature regulated to keep the whole station from melting down. But naturally, Samus gets trapped in here after just receiving the power bombs, so what does this destructive badass do? Blow up the power cores and make her escape, because cool chicks don't look at explosions. Or think about the repercussions of their actions, apparently. But yeah, this is where the obligatory escape countdown happens, which, again, made me feel like it was the end. You're forced to run back out through this exploding area as the heat quickly rises and security systems activate to prevent a total planet core meltdown. And naturally, she has to contend with a mini-boss attack also on the way out. I was going a little slow here because I suck at video games, and I got to the entrance of the area dangerously close to a full heat bar. And the security systems in front of me closed. I had a brief moment of assuming I'd failed. Guess I'd have to do that whole part again. And then the game faded back in with Samus badly hurt on the other side of the gate. There was no way to succeed. It was a very clever and tense section, and some of the best environmental storytelling I've seen in the whole series, even more so because it came from a fan creation. But it was made even better by the fact that you can eventually travel back through part of the destroyed power core and grab a few optional items that you could only barely see before. I love re-exploring the remains of something after it's destroyed. It's just one of those little things that always gets me. I think it's from Super Metroid, when you go back down through basically the end of the original Metroid into like old Torian and see the destroyed Mother Brain capsule and stuff. Anyway, we're not there yet. Point is, this section was awesome and a great way to introduce the destructive power of power bombs, which weren't in the original Game Boy game. And speaking of new things, this remake also introduces an entirely new area, and it's probably my favorite. Like, it admittedly feels a little out of place in a Metroid game as it's more puzzle focused, but I loved every minute of it still. The gravity suit is also new to this game, so naturally they had to add an obligatory underwater section. But they combine it with a really cool, electromagnetism element and some really clever puzzles, as well as a convenient fast travel hub to facilitate backtracking with your drastically increased power set. It's the kind of convenience system that a fan would think of for sure, gating off the teleport tunnels with screw attack blocks and weaving in some new elements from the area you were just in to encourage you to revisit all those places again, as well as pick up anything you might have missed. But on the note of those new elements, after activating some kind of power node, these mystical glowing balls are flung all over the planet like you just pressed a switch in Super Mario World, and doors that were previously inaccessible can now be energized by hitting and navigating these balls into their own little power nodes. It's kind of like the boost ball nodes in the Prime games, but here you play a little bounty hunter mini-golf to get the ball where it needs to go. These are my favorite puzzles, probably in any Metroidvania game so far. And, I mean, they admittedly feel more like the kind of thing that would be in a future Ori game or something, but I don't care. It never got old, because the ball physics were surprisingly tight and accurate, and a few of them required some real critical thinking to solve. But yeah, also in this area are like electromagnetic fields that basically render Samus's abilities useless while she's in them. So you have to carefully navigate around them and safely kill enemies when you're not being disabled. This section is still clever, but not quite as good. But then you reach the gravity suit, which not only lets you move freely in the underwater sections, but also neutralizes the electromagnetic fields, so dashing back out of this place is a breeze, and I could just focus on more of those fun ball power puzzles, as I did a bunch of backtracking with basically every item in the game, except the ice beam. And yeah, that's really the last major change in this game. The ice beam is the final item you get. Honestly, it makes a lot of sense, as Metroids are notoriously weak to cold, so if they've basically taken over this planet, why would the item to easily render them frozen be grabbed so early? It should be buried pretty deep, which is what has allowed them to thrive so close to the surface. I did like how it was used for some early platforming puzzles in Samus Returns before you get the space jump, but in most cases you can manage fine with the spider ball and space jump anyway, so I kinda liked that they saved it for late game. There was also a surprising Samus fight here, which is one of the most iconic bosses from Metroid Fusion. It's a bit different in this game because it's encountered much later and isn't taken over by the X-Parasite from that game, but it's still a neat callback. And speaking of callbacks, I haven't touched much on the story of this version, since it's not really canon, but it does some really neat things with lore scans along the way. Similar to Metroid Prime's scan visor, except it's logged automatically and you can check in the menu at any time. I didn't pay much mind to a lot of this as I went because, like I said, it's not canon. If I'm gonna deep dive the story, I'll do it with Samus Returns. And I will, just give it time. But there's one part when I was backtracking that really surprised me, and I know someone would yell at me if I finished this video without bringing it up. There's a strange section of ceiling that looks like it can be destroyed, but you can't get to without power bombs, which created an elevator that went up, and back to the surface. Color me intrigued. Are they gonna do a secret Ridley fight too, like at the end of Samus Returns? The surface is mostly devoid of life, aside from a few dead Federation troopers, which I guess are still devoid of life, and an abandoned ship, which I could enter. Inside was dimly lit, and full of lore entries. I devoured these because it was actually some really solid fan lore that I wish was canon. It delves into research the ship's team found across multiple planets, and really just feels like a nerdy love letter to people like me who really care about Metroid lore. There's also a few Easter eggs here, such as the room where Samus will eventually get infected with the X-Parasite, as well as a secret boss fight against Genesis, another Metroid Fusion callback. Samus Returns also does some really cool things to tie itself to Fusion, which is fitting since the whole genesis of that game is a direct result of her actions on SR388, but this whole area fleshes out that connection a lot better, even if it doesn't dive as deep into the Chozo side of things as Samus Returns does. And if you couldn't tell, Metroid Dread hits that even harder, so it makes sense Mercury Steam laid the groundwork in their own game. The Genesis fight itself actually made me pretty mad, but the quieter moments of this section were really cool, and I loved the attention to detail with how the ship was laid out and decorated and everything. But with all that out of the way, we're on to the end of the game. And man, I hate it. I will say that the initial trek to the planet's depths, or whatever, was really neat. It evoked the quiet, lifeless element of the original way better than Samus Returns with its run-and-gun finale. Even though I haven't beaten the original Metroid 2, I've still watched a full run for research, so I know the whole idea here is supposed to be that the Metroids are the only thing alive down here. The abundance of other predators closer to the surface where new Metroids are hatched is supposed to contrast the lack of life down here close to the Metroid Queen. You just get to take in the sights and get nervous about why it's so quiet. And of course there's some stellar but minimal sound design here as well that really just brings the tension home. But the actual final area full of classic Metroids just felt annoying. And like it stole the whole shtick from Metroid 1 and 3 as they come in from the background and relentlessly hound you. The free shot and then switch to missiles for the kill mechanic never feels great. But the worst part is after all that genocide, there's no reprieve before the Queen. The final save point of the game is before you take out the rest of those Metroids, and the Queen is not even remotely easy, with multiple stages in a series of cramped spaces, so you either have to redo that whole part again, or do like I did and kill them all and then backtrack to that last save point. So then you get to go back through safely and with full health, but it just gets boring. It's so much wasted time if you aren't able to beat her on the first few tries. I honestly just got tired of making that trek.
Then get good, scrub.
Okay, who said that? I'm here alone. But yeah, I've never cared for the Metroid Queen as a final boss anyway, and this section kinda soured my mood toward the whole game and reminded me that it's still just a remake of Metroid 2. None of the super clever concepts it introduced can take away from the flawed structure it's attached to. But the sole developer of this fan game has supposedly been picked up by Moon Studios, the folks that made the Ori games, so I can't wait to see what they do next when not tied to this structure, especially seeing how great Mercury Steam did when they weren't tied to this structure. As a Metroidvania game, AM2R is brilliant and minimizes a lot of the issues I have with the Metroid 2 formula, but this was always going to be an uphill battle. I mean, I love Samus Returns too, but mostly in spite of its status as a remake. It plays great and feels buttery smooth to control. But Samus Returns and AM2R find surprisingly different ways to remake the same game, and they do so about as successfully as they can, considering they're basically building a nice modern house on a shitty crumbling foundation. That's why I'm so excited that Metroid Dread is blowing up, because it's so great to see what Mercury Steam can do with a new entry in the series, untethered from the issues of Metroid 2. But I'll give more thoughts on their games later. For now, I'll just say that Metroid 2 was an imperfect experiment in translating the Metroid formula for handheld audiences, And while I'm ultimately glad it exists because it helped to keep the series alive and bridge the gap between the NES and SNES entries, as well as introduce some great new mechanics, and my favorite power-up with the Spider Ball, I still just can't help but wonder why there's both a complete fan remake and official remake of this game, while Super Metroid sits stuck back in time on the Super Nintendo. Sure, you could argue it doesn't need a remake, whereas Metroid 2 was an inherently flawed Game Boy game that was made only slightly better with the advent of the Game Boy Color. But I'll be arguing soon that Super Metroid hasn't aged as well as we remember. Mostly from a controls and physics standpoint. It's still amazing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me know what you think of the trio of Metroid 2 games, as well as how fairly you think I judged them. This one should be an interesting discussion, as I know there's some seriously divided opinions on this game. And for those just sad I didn't spend more time on the 3DS version, stay tuned. It deserves its own video, but that'll happen after it can be compared to the next Mercury Steam title in the series. Dread is out now, but I need a bit more time with it to really analyze it against Samus Returns. Plus, we're not there yet anyway. There's still a few games in the series before then, so next time we'll be covering the Super Nintendo legend itself, Super Metroid. It should be an easy one, because there's only one version, right? Well, you'd think so, but that game is a beast all its own, and I'm still not totally sure what to say about it. See you next mission. Really care for how it's paced, though I do think AM2R is the best paced version of this game's structure. But if I'm gonna deep dive the story, nope.